On the wall above Old Hrol'dan, on the night before the morning that would make him into the first emperor of all Tamriel, a young man named Hjalti Earlybeard pressed his fingers to his throat and could not understand why it was burning. He was 20 years old. He was soaked through with the kind of cold rain that comes in off the reach when the storms have something to say. There were 9,000 reachmen below him in the dark, and there was no plan. There were no reinforcements coming from Falkreath. There was no clever trick of war that would save the wall he was standing on. There was in his throat a feeling he could not name, like something patient and old was trying very gently to climb out of him. By the morning of the next day, that feeling would have shouted a hole through a wall that had stood for 400 years. A long-dead Nordic king, hidden in the storm above his head, would have stepped quietly into the body of the boy on the wall, and neither of them would have understood on that wet morning what the next 30 years had already begun to be. One of them would become a god. The other one would be murdered, slowly, in pieces, across those 30 years, by the man he was about to save. Take a slow breath. There is no hurry tonight. We have the whole night. There is an older, quieter version of how a man named Hjalti became the god Talos, the version that lives beneath the chronicles the Empire let stand. The version, a heretical book attributed to the Underking himself, has been whispering in the silences for 400 years. There is something sitting at the center of this story that I want to hold until we have earned it. When it arrives, you will understand why the Empire spent the rest of its history trying to bury it. Settle in. The chronicles do not all agree on where Hjalti Earlybeard was born. The official records of the Empire he would found say he came across the cold sea from Atmara, the way the first Nords did, the way the old gods themselves were said to have walked. But the people of Alcair, an island kingdom off the coast of High Rock, will tell you he was born among them. Their bards still sing of him. Their feast day for his birth is still kept. The local children still know which inn he is supposed to have slept in the night his whole life began. Both versions cannot be true. And so we are already, before we have begun, inside the central problem of telling this story honestly. The man who became a god is the most chronicled and least known figure in the entire history of Tamriel. The empire he founded had 400 years to rewrite his beginning. It used every one of them. But this much the records do not contradict. When he was 20 years old, the boy named Hjalti led a small band of Colovian troops and Nord berserkers against the Reachmen of High Rock, and he fought well enough to drive them all the way back to the gates of Old Hrol'dan. The Reachmen were skilled in the deep magics of their homeland. They had held that fortress for generations. They had been pushed there by a young general no one had ever heard of, and they had every reason to expect that morning would bring relief or starvation, or something they could survive. Hjalti had no army left to wait with. His men were broken from the march. The king he was fighting for, Culhwch of Falkreath, could not send reinforcements that would arrive in time. There was no good reason to expect dawn to come kindly. And so on the night before, while his men slept badly under wet leather, Hjalti stood on a wall in a storm that had not been there an hour before. He stood there long enough to feel a thing in his throat he had been feeling, in pieces, his entire life. The way a man feels weather coming in his old wounds, and had never spoken about, and had no name for, and no idea how to use. The chronicles do not say what he was thinking. The chronicles never do. But the songs of Skyrim, the very oldest ones, will tell you something the Empire's records will not. They will tell you that what is sleeping in the throat of a dragonborn knows when it is being looked at. They will tell you that the greybeards on the throat of the world, far away in their high silence, knew before Hjalti did what was about to walk into him. They had warned someone else, just days before, what was coming. They had said, "Remember the color of betrayal." The someone else was already on his way. 2. Understand what came in the storm that night. You have to understand what storms used to be. The man inside it had a name, Wulfharth of Atmora. Though by the time he climbed into Hjalti's storm above Old Hrol'dan, almost nobody alive had ever met him in flesh. The 5 songs of King Wulfharth, sung in the Nordic mead halls of the deep north long after he was meant to have died, will tell you about him in pieces. They will not tell you he was a man so much as a force of weather that, every few centuries, agreed to wear a body for a while. He had been elected king of Skyrim in the early First Era, after the death of Hoag Merkila at Glenumbria Moors. His voice, the Thuum of the old tongues, was so powerful that he could not verbally swear his oath of office. The scribes had to write his oaths for him. If he had spoken them, the men around him would have died. So begins the first song of King Wulfharth. His first death came when an enemy god named Orki summoned the ghost of Alduin the World Eater, who ate the years out of every Nord in Skyrim until they were 6 years old. Boy Wulfharth begged Shor, the chief of the old Nordic gods, long murdered by the elves at the dawn of time, to fight Alduin on the spirit plane. Shor's ghost agreed. Watching that fight in the sky, the boy Wulfharth learned a new shout. What happens when you shake the dragon? Just so. He used it to pull the years back into his people, but in his hurry to save so many, he shook too many years out on himself. He grew older than the greybeards. He died. The flames of his pyre, the songs say, were so high they reached the hearth of Kine herself. That was the first time. Centuries later, when the Kaimer and the Dwemer fought the war that would end at Red Mountain and ruin Morrowind forever, the old Nordic tongues sang Shor's ghost into the world again. And Shor, needing a general, gathered up the scattered ashes of King Wulfharth and remade him. The Ash King, the Storm of Kine. He fought at Red Mountain. The chronicles cannot agree on what he did there or who killed him, but they agree he was killed. The 5th song of King Wulfharth is sad. The survivors came back under a red sky. That year is called Sun's Death. That was the 2nd time. Centuries later still, with the Akaviri sweeping down through Skyrim and Morrowind and threatening to drown them both, he was sung back from the grave a 3rd time, some say by Almalexia of the Tribunal, some say by the Skald King of Eastmarch, and remade himself again into a body of ash and storm to fight invaders he had never met before for a country that had never been his. He fought. He survived. He withdrew, as he always did, into the high silences of the world. By the night he climbed into Hjalti's tent in a storm, Wulfharth had died 3 times. He had been ash twice. He had outlived 2 civilizations. He was very, very tired. And then the greybeards on the throat of the world began to rumble. The signal that an emperor had been chosen. The signal a dragonborn had been born somewhere on the continent and was waking up, and would soon be ready to rule the entire world. Wulfharth, who had ruled Skyrim, who had outlived empires, who had been made of storm and ash for 3 lifetimes, naturally believed the prophecy was for him. He went to High Hrothgar to hear his name spoken aloud. He climbed 7,000 steps to be welcomed home. When the greybeards spoke, Ysmir Wulfharth was blasted to ash again. He was not the Chosen One. The Chosen One was a warrior youth from High Rock, a boy he had never met, a boy who carried a voice that was not his own. And as he gathered himself back together in the cold air above the 7,000 steps, becoming grey wind again, beginning the long blow southward to find this stranger he was prophesied to serve, he heard the Greybeard's last warning to him on the wind. Remember the color of betrayal, King Wulfharth. He thought he understood. He almost certainly did not. The chronicles say a storm came down that night and visited the camp of Hjalti Earlybeard. They say a long-dead Nordic king walked out of it and into Hjalti's tent. The fire did not go out, but it changed colors. The two of them spoke. Wulfharth taught Hjalti in a single night what the way of the voice took most of the tongues of Skyrim a lifetime to learn. By dawn, Hjalti had a thu'um. By dawn, the boy on the wall had a god in his throat. He went to the gates of Old Hrol'dan in the first grey light. The storm followed him, hovering just above his head, a thing the songs would later call the storm crown, the cloud that sits above a dragonborn when he is becoming what he is, and where Hjalti shouted, the stones of Old Hrol'dan came apart. Not toppled, came apart. The Reachmen had no answer for it. They could not have had an answer. There had not been a voice like that in the world for 1,000 years. His men poured in. The fortress fell. The Reachmen broke. By the time the sun was fully up over the Reach, an army that had no business existing was the only force left standing in the Western Kingdoms. And a young general from a small island nobody had heard of had taken his first step toward a continent. The Nords who had fought beside him began to call him by a new name that morning. They called him General Talos, Stormcrown, the same word they had used, in the old tongue, for the helmet of lightning that crowned the great gods of the Atmaran sky. They did not know yet that they were giving him the name that would be carved into 1,000 shrines across the next 400 years. They were just naming the thing they had seen. Some of them looked at the cloud above his head. Some of them looked at the man inside the cloud and did not know what they were looking at. Some of them, the older ones, the ones who had heard the songs, looked at the grey wind that came in and out of him and felt, in the very back of their minds, a small thing flicker. The thing you feel when you look at a guest who has not announced themselves. There is something Wulfharth never asked that morning, in the camp after Old Hrol'dan, that he would spend 30 years not asking. He was too glad to have been useful. He was too glad to have found someone worth being useful to. The question he did not ask was why the boy needed him at all. It would be many years before any of them understood what had walked into the body of their general at Old Hrol'dan. What came in the storm did not leave when morning came. It climbed into him. He carried it for 30 years. He never stopped to ask why it had agreed to come. The third man we have to find is the one nobody ever sings about. While Hjalti was making his name in the Reach, while Wulfharth was riding above his head as a cloud, there was a battlemage in the Imperial City named Zurin Arctus, and the chronicles will tell you almost everything about what he did, and almost nothing about who he was. He authored a treatise on war magic that Imperial battlemages still studied 400 years later. He served as Grand Vizier and Overseer of the Imperial City through some of the longest, ugliest years of the interregnum, when Tamriel had no emperor at all, and the throne sat empty in the heart of an empire that was not really an empire anymore. He was, by every account that has come down to us, the most accomplished mage of his generation. His magical skill, the records say, was unmatched. Some of the older books suggest a deep, unspoken connection to Magnus, the god of magic itself. None of those books explain it. What is easier to find between the lines of the records is the shape of his loneliness. He had no peers. The Imperial City he watched over had been emptied by war and hollowed by neglect. The throne he guarded had no occupant. The battlemages of his generation, who might have been his friends, had been thinned by decades of pointless fighting in the provinces. He was, And this is the thing the chronicles will not say plainly but cannot quite hide. The cleverest mind in Cyrodiil, at a moment when Cyrodiil had nothing for a clever mind to do. When General Talos and his Nord-Colovian alliance finally marched east, when the citadels of the Heartland surrendered before their armies almost without fighting, when this strange young general with the storm cloud over his head walked into the Imperial City to take a throne that nobody had been able to take in 400 years, Zurin Arctus was the man who placed the crown on his head. The chronicles will tell you that this was a political act. It was also, almost certainly, a private one. Zurin had finally found something worthy of his attention. A boy with a god in his throat, an empire forming around him, a continent as a project. He gave Hjalti the name Tiber Septim that day. Tiber, for the Cyrodiilic river that ran through the heart of the empire he had just inherited. Septim, the lineage that would now begin. He stepped back from the new emperor and watched him be a king. He did not know yet, on the day of the crowning, that he was the third side of a triangle. That a long-dead Nordic king was already living above the new emperor's head as a cloud. That a continent had not, in fact, been brought peace, but had been quietly handed 3 men, working as one, who would make it submit by the end of the next 30 years. He thought, on the day of the crowning, that he had found a friend. That was a kind of loneliness all its own. For most of the next 3 decades, the Empire walked Tamriel on 3 legs. The body of the work was Hjalti's, Tiber Septim's now. He was the warrior. He was the man who rode at the front of the columns, who slept in the field with his soldiers, who personally killed enough men in single combat that the legends began before the chronicles could catch up. Some of the chronicles will tell you that during the assault on the Imperial City, before he was crowned, he was wounded in a way that should have killed him. A high rock nightblade slipped past his guard and slit his throat. The palace burned around him while he bled. He survived, but the songs will tell you he could no longer shout after that. He whispered his orders for the rest of the conquest. The voice, which had been so loud at Old Hrol'dan that it had taken stones apart, was now small and torn, and yet his armies still seemed to be guided by it. The storm above his head had not gone anywhere. The mind of the work was Zurin's. He stayed in the Imperial City. He governed. He set up the apparatus of an empire that, until him, had been a dream. He ran the bureaucracy that fed the soldiers, paid the legions, kept the treasury solvent. He sent diplomats ahead of the armies. A peace before every war, a chance to surrender before every siege, that the chronicles credit with sparing more lives than any battle that Tiber Septim ever fought. The kingdoms that fell easily fell, because Zurin Arctus had reached them first. He never said this out loud. He didn't need to. He was making the empire that the man with the throat full of God was going to inherit. The wind of the work was Wulfharth. This is the part the chronicles only hint at. The Arcturian Heresy is more direct. While Tiber Septim was wounded and could only whisper, Wulfharth was sent, discreetly, to the places where Tiber's voice was most needed. He spoke for him in the field. He shouted in his place when shouts were required. The Empire began to talk, in soldiers' rumors, of an emperor who could be in 2 places at once. He could. One of him was in the Imperial City, governing. One of him was in the field, fighting. And one of him, the part nobody saw, was a long-dead king from Skyrim who had agreed to come down from a cloud to teach a boy on a wall how to shout, and who had never quite gone home. They became, across 30 years, something unusual. Not a court, not a triumvirate, a friendship. Wulfharth had not had a friend in centuries. The chronicles, when they speak of his older life at all, speak of him as a presence, a storm, a tongue, an ash king. not a man with a man's needs. But he had not been spoken to as a person, plainly, by someone who needed him without already being afraid of him, since long before he had begun dying for the first time. Hjalti, Tiber now, was the first. He stayed because of that. The friend Wulfharth believed he had finally found was the boy who would, in time, inherit him. He never quite saw it that way. Every word of teaching he had given that boy on the wall was, slowly, a withdrawal. Every campaign he fought beside him was a long handing over. The cloud above the Emperor's head was not a passenger. It was a slow draining. He just hadn't been told that yet. The chronicles disagree about when the friendship began to crack. The Arcturian Heresy is exact about it. It was Morrowind. Wulfharth had spent his life, his 3 lives, wanting one thing, beyond all other things. He wanted the elves dead, the Aldmer of Somerset, the Chimer of Resdain, the Dwemer of Vardenfell, the Falmer of the Deep North. All of them. They had killed his god. They had murdered Lorcan at the dawn of time. The whole shape of Wulfharth's existence, the storm, the tongue, the breath of kine, was the long anger of mankind toward the elves who had broken shores, chest open and scattered his heart into the sea. When the Empire turned its eyes east, when Tiber Septim's armies marched into Morrowind, Wulfharth believed he was finally going to see the tribunal, the 3 god kings of the Dunmer who had stolen the divine power that was rightfully Lorcan's, destroyed. He was not. The tribunal did not fight. They negotiated. They handed Tiber Septim something he wanted more than vengeance, a piece of a brass god, the Numidium, which we will come back to, in exchange for an armistice. The terms of the armistice did not just spare the tribunal, they confirmed them. The Dunmer were allowed to keep their religion, their autonomy, their gods. The Empire would rule Morrowind only on paper. In practice, the 3 god kings who had been Wulfharth's enemies for 2,000 years would walk away from his war untouched. Wulfharth was furious. The chronicles do not have to imagine the fury. The heretical book uses the word abandoned. He left the Empire. He went back to wandering. He stopped riding above the Emperor's head as a cloud. He thought, on the night he left, that he had finally seen what the Greybeards had warned him about. Remember the color of betrayal. The color, he believed, was the color of an empire that had decided to spare the elves who killed its god. The color was the color of his friend's diplomacy. The color was the color of every concession the boy he had taught to shout had agreed to make to keep the peace. He was wrong about which one. The real betrayal was not Morrowind. The real betrayal had not yet been imagined. It was still 10 years away. It was being slowly thought up, not by Tiber Septim, who in this period did not yet know what the Dwemer had built, but by Zurin Arctus, the mind of the Empire, the man with no peers, the man who had finally been given a problem worthy of him. Zurin was researching the brass thing the tribunal had handed over. He was getting close to figuring out what would make it walk. The brass thing had a name, Numidium, Anumidium in some of the older books, the brass tower in others, the brass god. The chronicles all agree on what it was meant to be. Long before the Empire of Men, the Dwemer of Resdain, the elves of stone and tone, the deep folk, the ones who built cities of brass and steam beneath the mountains, had decided to make a god of their own. Not a sky god, not a borrowed god. A thing they would build with their hands, out of the laws of the world they did not believe in. A tonal architect named Kagrenak designed it. It was 1,000 feet tall. It was made of brass that was not really brass, by methods that nobody alive understood. It was meant to walk Tamriel and to become through the suffering and the unbelief of the Dwemer themselves, the new god of a race that had decided gods were not real and they would have to be made. Kagrenac never finished it. The Dwemer vanished from Tamriel before they could turn it on. What was left of it was scattered. The Tribunal of Morrowind kept a peace. Pieces drifted to the Empire over the centuries. By the time Zurin Arctus had it on a table in the Imperial City, he had most of it. He could not, however, make it move. The Numidium had been designed to run on the heart of Lorkhan, the actual physical heart of the dead god of mankind, buried inside Red Mountain after the elves had killed him. Zurin did not have the heart. The heart belonged, in his time, to a nightmare in Vardenfell that the Tribunal had not yet told him about. He could not walk into Red Mountain and take it. He worked from incomplete plans. He concluded, wrongly but reasonably, given what he had, that the Numidium did not need the heart. It needed a heart. The life force of any sufficiently great being, bound into a soul gem of sufficient size and craft, would do the work. He proposed to Tiber Septim that they build such a soul gem. They would call it the Mantella, the crux of transcendence. He would put his own life force into it. He would, in essence, give his heart to power the brass god that would conquer the rest of Tamriel for his friend. He proposed it because he had no peers. He proposed it because the empire he had spent 30 years building would not be safe until the Aldmeri dominion of Somerset Isle had been broken. He proposed it because he loved his friend. Tiber Septim listened to the proposal carefully. He thanked Zurin. He told him to keep working. And then he sent for Wulfharth. He had not seen Wulfharth since Morrowind. He sent word, the chronicles say, that the old king had been right all along, that the tribunal should never have been spared, that a new plan was being made in secret to finish the job. He invited him to a council in the Imperial City to discuss it. The chronicles will tell you what happened in that council in different ways. The official records of the Empire, the histories that were written in the centuries after and edited carefully by the descendants of the man who ordered them, will tell you that Zurin Arctus was the one who died, that he tried to assassinate the Emperor, that the loyal Imperial Guards killed him, that his last act of treachery was to attempt a coup. The Empire mourned him as a hero who had been corrupted at the end. They named buildings after him. The version of the story that survived is the version Tiber Septim gave the Elder Council the morning after, with bodies still on the floor. The Arcturian Heresy tells it differently. The heresy is attributed, by tradition, to the Underking himself, to whatever it was that walked away from the council with no body left and a heart it could not find. It is a heretical book. It is forbidden in the Imperial City. It is the only chronicle written by a man who was actually in the room. Here is what it says. Wulfharth came. He came in good faith. He came because his friend had said in writing that he had been right, and that the elves of the tribunal would die after all, and that a plan was being made and his counsel was needed. He arrived at the chamber. He was tired, the way he had always been tired. He had been a storm and a king and a tongue and a son of Kine, and what he wanted now, in the body he had assembled out of ash for the 3rd time, was to be in a room with a friend and a plan. The chamber was full of Imperial Guards. The fight was very fast. He killed all of them. He was Wulfharth. There was no one in that room who could stand against the storm of Kine in close quarters. The bodies fell quickly. He turned, breathing hard, looking for Tiber. Zurin Arctus was in the chamber too. Zurin was holding a soul gem, the gem he had built, the Mantella. Wulfharth understood, in the last second before Zurin's spell hit him, that the heart that was supposed to power the brass god was never going to be Zurin's. It had never been Zurin's. The mind of the Empire had been working from incomplete plans. He had needed the heart of a being who was like Lorcan, the heart of an avatar, a Shezareen, a man who was a piece of the dead god of men. There was only one of those in Tamriel. There had only ever been one. The Mantella took him. With his last breath in the body that he had built 3 times, the heart that the soul gem had not finished swallowing roared a hole through Zurin Arctus's chest. The most accomplished mage in Cyrodiil, the man who had crowned an emperor, the loneliest mind in the Heartland, fell to the floor of that chamber with his ribs blown open and his life burning out behind him. He was dead before he hit the stone. Every Imperial guard in the room was already dead. Wulfharth's body had reverted to ash on the floor. His soul was inside the green gem. The room was silent. Tiber Septim, who had not been in the chamber while it happened, walked in alone. He stepped over the bodies of the guards. He stepped over Zurin Arctus. He bent down and picked up the mantella. The chronicles do not say what his face did. The chronicles never do. When the Elder Council arrived, he told them, calmly, with grief in his voice, that his battlemage had attempted a coup, and that his loyal guards had given their lives to stop him. He had the dead guards buried as heroes. He had Zurin mourned as a tragedy. He took the mantella to the brass god they had been preparing in the halls of Colossus, in Elsewhere, and he socketed it into the empty chest of the Numidium. The Numidium walked. Somerset Isle, which had been the last kingdom to stand against him, fell beneath a 1,000-foot brass god with the heart of a Nordic king beating in its chest. The conquest of Tamriel was complete. The Third Empire was born. The man who rose from that war became a god. He had paid for it in the heart of a friend who had been warned 3 lifetimes earlier by the old voices on the throat of the world. What color betrayal would wear? The color was the color of trust. In the centuries that followed, when the cult of Talos rose across Tamriel, and the shrines were built and the prayers were said, the people who prayed believed they were praying to one man, the man who had united Tamriel, the man who had walked the brass god into Alinor and brought peace, the man who had ascended to the seat of sundered kings and taken his place beside Akatosh and Kinnereth and Stendar in the company of the divines. What they were actually praying to was 3. The chronicles will not say it plainly because the chronicles cannot. They can only put the pieces beside each other and let the reader choose what to do with them. The official records give us Tiber Septim, the warrior, the conqueror, the founder. The histories of the Imperial battlemages give us Zurin Arctus, the mind, the architect, the betrayed. The songs of Skyrim give us Ysmir Wulfharth, the storm, the tongue, the dragon of the north, who appeared to a young general at Old Hrol'dan and taught him how to shout. The greybeards of High Hrothgar, who do not lie even when it would be easier, will tell anyone who climbs the 7,000 steps to ask that the title of Ysmir is given only to the Dragonborn, and that Tiber Septim was indeed Ysmir, and that Wulfharth was Ysmir before him, and that a single body cannot truly hold 2 voices, unless, of course, that body is no longer one body. What walks the sky with the name Talos is not a man. He is a graveyard with a name. He is Hjalti the warrior, who held the body. He is Wulfharth the storm, whose voice was eaten and whose heart became fuel. He is Zurin the battle mage, whose mind was the architecture and whose chest was the price. He is the warrior, the storm, and the mage. He is the rebel, the watcher, the king. He is in the old triune pattern that the wise of every culture in Tamriel will recognize when they see it. The same pattern as the tribunal, the same pattern as the gods before the gods. three faces of a single mantled thing. The empire that worshipped him for 400 years did not know this. The Thalmor of the Aldmeri Dominion, in the present moment, do. After Somerset fell, after the conquest was done, after the Numidium had been used not just to break the elves, but quietly, in the years that followed, to crush the neutral royal families of Tamriel and replace them with houses loyal to the Septim line, something else happened that the chronicles can only half tell. A rotting wizard appeared in the sky. He had, the records say, no proper body. He was a column of ash that had a will. He came from the west, where Wulfharth's old country had been. He was furious. The Arcturian Heresy is direct. It was Wulfharth, or the part of Wulfharth that the Mantella had not finished swallowing, free for one terrible final hour. The official records suggest it was Zurin Arctus, somehow not entirely dead, returned to undo what the Empire had become. The truth, as with everything in this story, may be that it was both. The Mantella may have held more than one heart by then. The two men had died in the same room, in the same minute, by each other's hands. Their ashes had mingled on the floor. What the soul gem held may not have been one soul anymore. What is certain is what happened next. The wizard in the sky attacked the Numidium. The brass god that had conquered Tamriel was struck in mid-air over the conquered lands by the fury of the man whose heart was inside its chest. The Numidium broke. Its body fell. The wizard fell with it, pounded into a black smear in the earth by the brass god's last flailings. The Mantella, the green gem, the heart, the crux of transcendence, went the other way. It was blown upward, out of the world, into Aetherius itself, into the realm of the stars, into the place beyond the limits of Mundus, where mortal hands cannot follow. It is still there. 400 years later, beneath the constellations the greybeard still read, "The heart of the king who taught a boy to shout above Old Hrol'dan is still beating. He cannot fully die, because the gem holding him is not on the world. He cannot be released, because the body that should hold him has been ash for centuries. He is, and there is no kinder word for it, buried in the sky. He is buried in the sky, and the man he died for has become a god. He is the third member of that god, and he is not allowed to leave it. Now we are in the present. Now we are in Skyrim." In solitude, on a spring morning in 4E201, a group of Thalmor justiciars in their gold and black robes stand in the square where until recently a shrine to Talos used to be. The shrine has been removed, the pedestal has been broken up, the stones have been carted away. A small girl who used to bring her father's prayers to that shrine watches them work from a doorway across the square. She does not understand why this is happening. The adults around her have stopped explaining. The Thalmor will tell anyone who asks that the ban on Talos worship is a clause of the White Gold Concordat, the treaty that ended the Great War. They will tell you it is law. They will tell you that the worship of a man who was only ever a man cannot be permitted in a civilized empire. They will not tell you what they actually believe, what the Thalmor will not say in any treaty, but what their long, patient practice across Skyrim makes plain to anyone who watches them closely enough, is that they take Talos seriously. They take him more seriously than many of the Nords who still pray to him. They are not banning his worship because they do not believe in him. They are banning his worship because they believe a god made of belief can be unmade by silence. If no one remembers the names beneath the name, if no one remembers Hjalti and Wulfharth and Zurin, if no one prays to him aloud, builds shrines for him, sings the old songs about the boy on the wall and the storm above his head, if the worship dies in one generation, the god dies in the next. The Thalmor are working on the patient erasure of a deity, not zealotry, metaphysics. They believe, and they may be right, that the gods of mankind are a younger and softer kind of god than the gods of the elves, and that they live by being remembered, and that they can starve. So the shrines come down. The priests go into hiding. The old songs are sung quietly in the back rooms of mead halls in Windhelm and Riften, where the justiciars cannot hear. The cult becomes underground. The next generation will know the name, but only as a forbidden one. The generation after that will know it as a story. The generation after that will not know it at all. The Thalmor are not wrong. That is the part of this story that will keep you awake if I let it. But there is a thing the Thalmor do not know, even with all of their planning. There is a thing the Imperial Chronicles never wrote down, because they could not have written it down without admitting what Talos really is. If Talos dies, if the worship ends, if the cult goes silent, if the name is forgotten and the mantle empties out, then the heart in the sky has nothing left to power. The graveyard with a name will not be a graveyard anymore. It will be 3 men, finally allowed to be apart. Hjalti will be a warrior who died at 108, 400 years ago, in a bed in the Imperial City, surrounded by a family that loved him. Zurin Arctus will be a battlemage who was killed by a friend in a chamber in the Imperial City, and who has been waiting a very long time for the soul gem holding him to break open. And Wulfharth, the king who taught a boy on a wall how to shout, the storm who was warned and went anyway, the heart in the sky that has been beating for 4 centuries with no body to come home to, will at last be allowed to scatter. The Thalmor are doing a cruelty. They are also, without knowing it, doing a kindness no one has done for the Storm of Kine since he climbed into Hjalti's tent at Old Hrol'dan. That is the color of betrayal, finally seen the right way around. It is the same color as mercy, when you are tired enough. Go back, in your mind, to the wall above Old Hrol'dan. It is empty now. The young man with his fingers pressed to his throat has been dead for 400 years. The reachmen below him have been ash for longer. The shrine that the Nords later built in that place, where his men first called him Stormcrown, has been pulled down by justiciars. The stones have been carted away. The wall is just a wall again. The storm is gone. The greybeards on the throat of the world have not spoken in 100 years. The voice of the Dragonborn that Wulfharth taught to a boy on a wall is being carried quietly by someone else now, somewhere far from here, walking a road in the snow, not yet sure why people stop on the road to look at them. The cycle goes on. It always goes on. But here, on this empty wall, on this still morning, something is finishing. The cult of Talos is dying. The shrines are coming down. The god who was 3 men is being allowed, slowly and against his will, to come apart. If you listen, you can almost hear the heart in the sky beating a little softer than it used to. If this little tour through the long story of the man who became a god has been useful to you, the channel runs on the simple kindness of a like and a follow before you fall asleep tonight. It is the only thing that keeps the lights on for the next one. Thank you for being here. The wall above Old Hrol'dan is empty. The rain has stopped. The reach is quiet. Somewhere very far up, in the dark between 2 of the older constellations, a green gem is holding a heart that is finally, after 400 years of being buried in the wrong place, beginning to slow down. The man it belonged to taught a boy how to shout in a storm. Once, a long time ago, the boy became a god. The man was not invited. Sleep well.